The bilateral symmetrical stuff allows you to ramp up that force and that pressure, because from an axial skeletal standpoint, same position.
Good morning. Happy Monday. I have Neuro Coffee in hand, and it is perfect. Okay. Interesting weekend this past weekend. Closed up shop on iFest 2.0. Everything getting moved over to iFest 3.0. Training is up and running. Physical therapy should be up and running this week. So kind of excited about that. Digging into today's Q&A. This is a question that Manuel initiated on one of the more recent Coffee and Coaches conference calls, that we were talking about force production on single leg, relative motion in the pelvis, and the influence of bilateral symmetrical activities. And one of the things we're going to recognize is that things don't have to look exactly like something to have a favorable influence. For instance, bilateral symmetrical activities, high force producing activities, are actually helpful in single leg activities. So for instance, we talked about agility in this call, where the forces get very, very high, and there's a point in time where we want a reduction in relative motion within the axial skeleton for that high force production. This is where bilateral symmetrical activities come in handy, because we don't have to worry about the turning that's associated in the control element of a single leg activity. So we can focus on that high force production that we're actually going to utilize in a single leg activity. So as we would move into a cut, and that point in time where we need the highest force production to the ground, the least amount of relative motion gets closer and closer and closer to what would be represented in the high force of that bilateral symmetrical activity. So again, that's why they are useful. Anyway, I think you'll find this call somewhat useful. If you would like to participate in a 15-minute consultation, please go to askbillhartman@gmail.com, askbillhartman@gmail.com. Put 15-minute consultation in the subject line. We will arrange that at our mutual convenience. Everybody have an outstanding Monday, and I'll see you later.
You know, when we, so as we lift heavier and whatnot, we lose relative motion, or at least we don't want relative motion as much.
We're limiting it. Yes.
We want to limit it.
If you're moving, there's yeah.
So, you know, in an example of, say, maybe a squat or a deadlift, so then are we more concerned with how the femur moves within the pelvis rather than the relative motion of the pelvis? Because I was thinking about last time we talked when you do a single leg movement with your true single leg with one foot off the ground, you lock the pelvis into position, and you're really training how the femur moves within the pelvis. So I was just trying to connect those two concepts between lifting heavy and then true single-legged work.
Yeah. So, and again, we have to consider the context. So it's like the relative load that you're trying to move. So let's just say that we're really close to our peak capabilities. If I alter the shape of the pelvis as I am moving, and it is changing. So that's the thing that we like, you know, if this is the full excursion of the pelvic shape change, I might be doing this, right? Which is one of the limitations of force output, by the way, right? So people that change shape a lot as they're moving weight, they don't lift a lot of weight because they can't maintain the force output. They can't maintain pressure. There's too much fluctuation in pressure. So the closer I get to peak output, the less motion I want, because I need to maintain the pressure that provides me the force output. Right. So the amount of relative motion in the pelvis has to be reduced to increase force production. For me to perform the activity itself, okay, that hip joint has to move. Like for me to go down and pick up a bar off the floor and then to stand up with it, the hip joint's moving, right? And again, that's one of the limitations of picking the weight up, right? So those that can move the hip through a sufficient excursion to say that you're doing the lift, but yet still maintain the pressure via reduction of relative motions, they lift more weight. Right? So you're going to always move in that direction. And you can tell, right? I mean, you've done enough light squats versus heavy squats that you can tell that there's just a totally different sensation associated with max effort work compared to the lighter speed stuff or just a light warm up kind of a weight. right? And you can tell because you can breathe, right? So we can go back to Andrew's question, where we're talking about context. It's like, okay, let's just put, 60 kilos on the bar versus, 200. It's like your behavior has to change because the amount of pressure that you're creating is significantly different. So here, let me throw out a little bit of context. Okay. When you talk about cutting activities, like agility, a lot of people will say that you shouldn't use bilateral symmetrical lifts because you're pushing off of one leg when you're making a cut. And they say, therefore, single leg work is more specific. And I would argue that bilateral symmetrical activities magnify the pressure that's associated with your ability to hold a position, right? So that as you change direction, there's a point where you got to stop motion, right? Just like everything else. The bilateral symmetrical stuff allows you to ramp up that force and that pressure because from an axial skeletal standpoint, same position, right? So there's tremendous value in high force bilateral symmetrical activities with less relative motion, because when I got to stop motion under any circumstance, whether it's through a single leg or through two legs, I can take advantage of my shape changing capabilities to produce higher levels of force.
What about the reverse of that?
Explain the reverse.
For example, if you're doing a lot of bilateral activities, then what's the utility of doing true single-legged work? Or, or at least some people could say, yeah, you don't, who cares about your one-legged squat when you squat with two legs? You know what I mean?
Well, so again, it is different in regards to how you're going to be driving the force through the axial skeleton. It does. So by saying that there's high force production with bilateral symmetrical does not negate the value of being able to push through a single leg. What I'm saying is that when we talk about specificity, there are other elements of specificity. So ground contact through the single leg support is actually important because I need to orient over a single point of contact to produce that force. So that, again, there is value in that. So it would be like saying, if you want to increase your agility, do back squats, and you could be right, but then to not do any agility at all and expect that to translate, it may not work, right? So there are elements that, and especially the turn that's associated with single leg, right? So when I'm bilateral symmetrical, okay, I don't have to worry about turning quite so much because of my ground contacts help me reduce that element. When I go to a single leg, as soon as I pick up that other foot, my body wants to start turning, right? And so I need to teach myself to resist that turn, thus the importance of the specificity of working on a single leg, right? So to move in and out of that, where I do need some relative motion, it may behoove me to do both, right? Then again, what do I need them most, right? What will provide the greatest benefit?